The Frumkes Center for Writing and Culture at Hunter College presents 10 years of best-selling authors and great thinkers. Each week we broadcast new videos from our 10-year speaker archive online for free at our website. We look forward to seeing you again when it's safe. Please enjoy this presentation from the archives of the Frumkes Center for Writing and Culture at Hunter College.
Psychology, eminent thinkers often proudly trace their intellectual roots to Sigmund Freud. As an analytic philosopher, Ned Block was a student of Hilary Putnam, who in turn was mentored by Willard Van Orman Quine. In philosophy, this is about as good as it gets. Today, Ned is Silver Professor of Philosophy and Psychology at New York University and was chair of the philosophy program at MIT from 1990 to 1995, and I think he taught there for about 20 years. He has made important contributions to the philosophy of mind and to matters of consciousness and cognitive science. He is a co-editor of The Nature of Consciousness, Philosophical Debates, author of numerous books including Consciousness, Function, and Representation, and noted for presenting the blockhead argument against the Turing test as a test of intelligence, and for many other papers. In short, most people regard Ned as the world's expert on consciousness, whatever that may turn out to be. I myself have known Ned for many years, and while cognizant of his brilliance, regard him almost more importantly as a nice guy without a swelled head. It gives me great pleasure this evening to introduce Ned Block as our first speaker in the Hunter Writing Center's 2014 Great Thinker Series.
To be an expert on something that it is widely thought that no one knows anything about. Okay, so the topic is cognition and consciousness, what they are and what the difference is. So the background is that in philosophy and cognitive science, a lot of people think that consciousness is really a subcategory of cognition. And I'm going to be arguing for the opposite. Let me say, feel free to speak up during the talk. I don't need to wait till the end for questions. Although, questions of the hardest questions should wait for the end. But we don't always know which ones are the hardest. So I need the lights down low. So I'm going to have a lot of things on the screen. So if you can't see the screen, try moving to where you can. Okay, so I'm going to start with this debate between people who think perception is sparse, and I'll say what that's supposed to come to, and the people who say that perception is rich. So what I'm going to say is that the evidence that seems to show that perception is sparse really should be blamed on cognition being sparse, and that perception is rich. So let me start with an experiment that is one of the pieces of evidence that perception is rich. This is an experiment done by George Sperling. It was his PhD thesis in 1960. So the idea is you see a grid of letters, and then there's a blank. And if you ask people to name the letters, they can only name 3 or 4 of those letters, even though they felt they saw all of them, and that they had a kind of ongoing experience of all of them. So what Sperling did was he decided to test this idea, this ongoing image of all the letters that people felt they had been known for at least since the mid-19th century, and maybe even in ancient times. And what he did was he gave people a high tone, which meant report the top row, a medium tone, which meant report the middle row, and a low tone, which meant report the bottom row. And what he found was they could report 3 or 4 from any given row. Okay, so they had some kind of access to almost the whole thing, was the idea. Even though they could report 3 or 4 only from the whole thing with no cue, when it's cued, they could report 3 or 4 from any given row, suggesting they had a very rich experience that they could pull things out of. This is sometimes called partial report superiority, and there's been a lot of experiments done on this kind of thing. Now, in his original paper, that's a picture of Sperling, he said, subjects enigmatically insist that they have seen more than they can report afterwards. And this is really a clue to the point of view that I'm going to be arguing for. Reporting depends on cognition. Seeing all those things is conscious perception. So what I'm going to say is conscious perception is richer than cognition. You can only report 3 or 4 things. You can only store 3 or 4 things in your what's called working memory. But you can see a lot more things at once, according to me. And here's another psychologist also pointing out that subjects and experimenters serving as subjects continue to insist that they are momentarily conscious of all the elements in the array. So this supports the idea that perception is rich. Now notice that I'm not claiming that any perceptual items are inaccessible. So necessarily most of those Sperling items are unaccessed, not accessed, but it doesn't follow that any are inaccessible. So there's a very important difference between unaccessed and inaccessible. You can compare it to a lottery. Necessarily almost all the tickets in a lottery lose, but it doesn't mean that there's any that can't win. Okay, so the idea is those Sperling items, those items in your percept, are all accessible, even though only a very small number can be actually accessed. Okay, so now I'm going to move to give you some evidence that perception is sparse. And what I'm going to use is, I'm going to start off with this kind of this is an experimental display. I hope you can see it. Can you see it over there?
Yeah.
The idea is there's a picture, a blank, another picture that differs slightly from the first picture, then a blank, and then it starts all over again. And the interesting thing is that people have a lot of trouble seeing what the difference is, and you're about to experience that, assuming this all works. Okay, so you're seeing a picture, a blank, and then another picture that differs from the first picture. How many see what the difference is? Okay, don't say it. All right, but I will show you the difference. And you'll be surprised when you see what the difference is, I predict. Those leaves are there in one picture, but not the other. Is that surprising?
Yep.
Good, I'm glad you're surprised. Okay, so why are you surprised? You're surprised because it's a big thing, right in the, near the middle of the picture. You'd think, given how many things you see, that you would have seen it. Okay, here's another one. So again, something is changing between what you're seeing is a picture, a blank, another different picture, a blank, and then it goes all over again. And for some of these, people can just see it 100 times and not see what's changing. How many see what's changing? Or more this time.
Oh, no.
How many see what's changing this time? Guys, color of pen.
No way.
How many see what's changing now? Nobody sees what's changing? How many see what's changing? Okay, it's something rather crucial. It's the engine of the airplane. Okay, now this one is a pathetic thing. It doesn't work as well. And I'm using it. You'll see why I'm using it. This is It's going to be very slow, I'm afraid. It's meant for, I'm using a Mac and it's meant for a PC and it doesn't really work very well. Okay, you know, what's changing in this one is this bar. It moves up and down. Now this gives you a clue. Here is an eye tracking trace of that picture. And what you see is that people's eyes, which reflects their attention, go from one thing to another, but there are some things that get almost no hits. And one of those things that gets almost no hits is that bar. So if you want a prescription for making one of these displays where people don't see what's changing, you look and see what people look at, and you change the things that they tend not to look at. Okay? So that's why this has been called a form of inattentional blindness. It's been shown that it depends on lack of attention. Okay? The things that can be changed are the things you're not attending to. But there are two completely different ideas of what's going on. One is you don't see the things that are, the features that are changing. That's the inattentional blindness interpretation. The other is you do see them, but you don't conceptualize them at a level that would allow you to notice the change. So it's the difference between percepts and concepts. And that difference is a difference that I'm going to be talking about. The question is, do you not have the percept of the feature that's changing? Or do you have the percept but lack the concept of the feature that's changing? Okay? So, and a concept is defined by its role in thinking, cognition. A percept is part of your perceptual consciousness. So that's why this issue gets at the heart of the difference between perception and cognition. If the perception is changing, it's one thing if the percept is there, but the cognition is what's at fault. That's a completely different theory of what's going on. So the inattentional blindness fits with the idea of sparse phenomenology. You don't really experience those things that are changing. Phenomenology is the content of consciousness. The inattentional inaccessibility, the difference, that's rich phenomenology and sparse cognition. Completely different story. Sometimes the inattentional blindness idea is described as representation failure, whereas the inattentional inaccessibility, the difference, is described as comparison failure. Okay, so I hope you feel that those demos really do make the sparse perception more plausible than you might have thought it was. Now, I'm going to show you some more demos that go in the other direction. And here, so these are other kinds of inattentional blindness, so-called inattentional blindness or change blindness. So this is an interesting thing. This comes from a something by Ode Oliva and George Alvarez. And I hope I've tricked you, because while you were looking at this thing, there were some very large changes in it. How many saw the change? How many didn't see the change? Maybe that's better. Okay, so I'm going to see if I can show them to you. Anybody want to say what changed? What?
One of the columns.
One of the columns? What columns?
In the middle.
One of these columns?
Over the right.
I don't think so, but maybe they're one. That's not the big change, though.
Over the right.
And so what do you think changed?
Car window.
What?
Car window.
The car window? Maybe, but that's not the big change.
I saw the blue
What?
sign.
The awning color changed.
Okay, I'm going to show you the change. I think people thought they saw the change maybe when they didn't. So I'm not exactly sure. Maybe there are a few items that are changed, but I'm going to move this slider back.
Yeah, the right, the blue sign. I saw it.
Oops. So here, I'm going to do it again. So this building in the back,
Where it says bar, that change, it goes away.
You see the slow change?
Right.
So here, I'll show you this is a picture of the beginning and end. So this is the end.
The doors.
Blue sign. Blue sign over on the right.
Okay, there are a lot of changes. Okay, but look, let's see what the lesson is of this, okay? The lesson is there were a lot of big things that you certainly saw, but you didn't notice the change because you didn't mentally categorize them. So it supports the inattentional inaccessibility idea, not the inattentional blindness idea. Here's another one like that. Okay, so something's going to change. And your job is to look and see what it is. These are very slow changes, I'm afraid. So raise your hand if you see what's changing. No, don't say. Raise your hand if you see what's changing. So most people didn't see what changed. Okay, you'll be surprised to learn what changed. What changed is the color of this thing went from red to blue. This huge expanse at the bottom. And here, I'll just show you. I won't try to switch it back. So it started off like this, and it ended up like that. Okay, so here's the point that this makes. You were looking at that thing very carefully, looking for what changed. You certainly saw that. Okay? It's not like you never saw it. You saw it, you just didn't conceptualize it at a level that would allow you to notice the change. So this argues for rich perception, sparse cognition, because it's a question of conceptualization of the thing. So these slow shifts support the inattentional inaccessibility idea, the idea that what's going on in this is you didn't conceptualize the changes. So here is another thing. This is a fun thing. This is a movie.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
But how did you know?
Madam, as any horticulturist will tell you, one does not plant petunias until May is out. Take her away. It's just a matter of observation. The real question is, how observant were you?
So he's now the camera's going to pull back, and you're going to see the whole thing filmed from further back.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
So this is a BBC ad for bicycle safety. So the idea here, now here's what the point, I don't know what point they had in mind, but the point I'm using this to make is take the guy's coat, okay? You saw his coat. He was the center of your attention. You know, he was speaking, he was directing attention to other people, but you saw him and his coat. He changed his coat in the middle and nobody noticed, right? You saw the coat, you saw the color of the coat, you didn't conceptualize it as having the color it did, and so you didn't notice the change. So the idea is, I take this to support the idea of of sparse cognition with rich perception, rich conscious perception. Okay, here's another one. Now, of course, you will have maybe we should have this thing off. Can you turn that light off because it makes it a little harder to see?
It's good. It's okay.
Okay, well, here's another one.
Hi, I'm Richard, this is Sarah, and we're going to perform the amazing colour-changing card trick with this blue-backed deck of cards. Now the idea is very simple. I'm just going to spread the cards in front of Sarah and ask her to push any card towards the camera.
Right, okay, let's see. I'm going to go for this card here.
Okay. Now Sarah could have selected any card at all from the deck, but she selected the card which is now face down on the table. What I'm going to ask her to do is show us which card she selected.
Right, so the card that I chose was in fact the 3 of diamonds.
The 3 of diamonds, okay, excellent choice. That card goes back into the deck. Now I'm just going to spread the cards face up on the table. Give a little click of the fingers, and you'll see that Sarah's card here has now got a blue back. Not particularly surprising. What's slightly more surprising is all of the other cards have got red backs. And that is the amazing colour-changing card trick.
Okay, so it's just like the last one. There were all kinds of changes that... How many saw some of those changes? How many didn't see any changes? Good. And now what they're going to do is show you the whole thing over again from further back. Here's the start of the video.
Hi, I'm Richard, this is Sarah, and we're going to perform the amazing colour-changing card trick with this blue-backed deck of cards. Now the idea is very simple. I'm just going to spread the cards in front of Sarah and ask her to push any card towards the camera.
Right, okay, let's see. I'm going to go for this card here.
Okay. Now Sarah could have selected any card at all from the deck, but she selected the card which is now face down on the table. What I'm going to ask her to do is show us which card she selected.
Right, so the card that I chose was in fact the 3 of diamonds.
The 3 of diamonds, okay, excellent choice. That card goes back into the deck. Now I'm just going to spread the cards face up on the table. Give a little click of the fingers, and you'll see that Sarah's card here has now got a blue back. Not particularly surprising. What's slightly more surprising is all.
Okay. So, again, it supports this idea that because, that big, red background, you saw that? So it supports the idea that it's conception that is the bottleneck here, that not perception. So here's another one. You may have heard of this. But if you've heard of it, don't say anything. So here's what I want you to do. This is you have to work hard at this. So this is a team of white-shirted and black-shirted players. They are passing around a basketball. Your job is to count the passes from a white-shirted player to a white-shirted player. Ignore any passes that go to a black-shirted player. Okay? Everybody understand what you're supposed to do? Your job is to count. At the end of it, I want to hear a number of passes between members of the white-shirted team. Okay? Okay, and an important thing is I need you to make whatever noises you're going to make them now. Make them now and not during the video. I need absolute quiet during the video. Everybody understand that? Okay, so there's no, no noises. Okay. You ready? When I say go, then you start counting the passes from white shirt to white shirt. Everybody understand what you're supposed to do? 1, 2, 3, go. Okay? All right? Okay, but here's what I need. I need you to say whether you, okay, so raise your hand if you did not see the gorilla.
Oh, God.
Oh, good. Okay, now I'm going to show it again, and now you will notice the gorilla. Okay, so here's my story about this. My story is your attention was on the ball and the white shirted team members, and so you don't see the black thing. You don't see it. Sorry, I take it back. Oh, that's not what I think. That's what the other guys think. No, what I think is you saw it, but you didn't conceptualize it at a level that would allow you to notice it.
What, was the replay at the same speed as we saw it?
Exactly the same.
Oh.
This is low tech. It's just the same video. I just did it over twice.
Is there any way through hypnosis or some other way to pull it out of the unconscious?
No,
and
because
the question is there an unconscious going on?
Here's the thing. It's not unconscious. It's conscious. See, that's the thing. It's not unconscious. And the problem is this. There's a bottleneck, according to my story, there's a bottleneck between perception and cognition. Only about 3 or 4 things can get into cognition. It requires you to say something to yourself, like, oh, what's that shape, or something like that. Now, there's a little bit that can stay in some kind of perceptual memory, but there's no way to get it out. The only way, as you'll see in a minute, to get a line on it is to do, well, there are a number of experimental approaches that can allow you to get at it. But I believe that they support my point of view, although this is a major topic of dispute in the field.
So the other view would be that for some reason you want to deny the gorilla because you're focusing on the other thing, so that you deny what else is going on, but it's somewhere there.
No, the other view is you don't see it at all. So the two views are, certainly it has to do with attention. Everybody agrees to that. The two views are, the other guys say, without attention to the thing, you don't see it. What I say is, without attention, without much attention, you still see it, but attention is needed to conceptualize it and get it into your cognitive system so that you notice it. I blame it on noticing.
So if we saw the gorilla, what can we say about ourselves?
As far as I know, there's no predictive anything about whether you see it or not. It's just, the way you make these things. What?
We should get some good mark for having seen it.
No, you get a bad mark for having seen it because it means you weren't attending hard enough to the things you were supposed to be attending.
So how many were there? 14 transfers or 15? You don't know? Well, ask how many people saw 14.
How many thought there were 14 passes? How many thought there were 15 passes?
How many were there?
I don't know.
Doesn't matter.
I don't know. It's completely irrelevant.
But another point of contention might be whether consciousness goes along with perception or cognition, right? So one might say that you do see it, you perceive it, but unconsciously.
Yeah, no, that would be another story. Okay. In fact, that is the story that my opponents have. Okay, so here's a little summary, at least of my point of view on this. It's that this so-called change blindness is really inattentional inaccessibility, not inattentional blindness. The failure to notice changes is due to failure to conceptualize the things that change, often because of lack of attention, not failure to see them. And conceptualization is required for noticing. So that's what I'm taking this to support. Okay, so here's what my plan is. I don't know how much of this I'll get to. So I've just done sparse versus rich. And now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the opposing theory. And this is going to take this is going to be a little more demanding because there's going to be some actual experiments I'm going to tell you about. So this experiment is called the Attentional Blink. And the way it works is this. You get a plus sign, which you're supposed to fixate, and then you get a string of items among which there are two targets. In the case of this one, the targets are letters. So there's a K and an H. And then at the end, you say what the first letter you saw was and whether you saw a second letter and what the second letter was. And the finding is, if you saw the first letter, you're very unlikely to see the second letter, or if you see it, you won't know what it is. Everybody understand? It's called, the second letter is called, it is said that the second letter is blinked. So everybody get this? Any questions about what this is? Okay, so now I'm going to show you a little demo of this. I don't know how well this will work. It'd be great if we could turn off the light. Okay, so the targets here are green words, okay? Look for green words. You ready? It's going to take, you have to look hard because these are going to be really hard to see. Okay, how many saw throw? How many saw throw? What? You saw what? 2 green words. You saw 2 green words. Okay. So it's, you know, it's not well. Okay. So let's do it again. You have another chance. How many saw throw? Okay. So keep your hand up if you saw throw. And now the question is, did you see a second word? Did you see?
Or a second green, but I didn't see it.
Okay, so do you know what that second, those of you who have your hand up, what was that second one? What? No? No? What was the second one? What was the second one?
Attack.
What?
Follow?
No?
Pair?
No, good, good. This is what's supposed to happen. Those of you who got the first one didn't get the second one, which is exactly what is supposed to happen, okay? Okay, so nobody got the second one if they got the first one. I'll show you again so you can see what it was. Mentioned. It's mentioned. So the finding is, if you see the first one, you don't see the second one. And the reason you don't see the second one is your attention is used up on processing the first one. Okay? So that's why you don't see the second one. Now here is my main opponent, Stanislaus Nahad, who's just come out with a 2014 book on consciousness, arguing for his point of view. So he says, in a recent study of the attentional blink, that's the very thing we just saw, we observed that about 180 milliseconds after stimulus presentation, the occipital temporal, this is a brain, this is the back of the head, the front of the head, this is the occipital temporal area here, this is the frontal area. The brain is actually extremely simple. The front of it is for cognition, the back of it is for perception. It's as simple as that. So the occipital temporal event-related potentials, this is a measure, EEG measure that you can do with little grids on your head, evoked by an invisible word, were large and essentially indistinguishable from those evoked by a visible word. Yet on invisible trials, the participants' visibility ratings did not deviate from the lowest value used when no word was physically present. Thus, intense occipital temporal activation can be accompanied by a complete lack of conscious report. And that's the occipital temporal activation. So these arrows mean the subject is not attending to the stimulus. That's because the stimulus is blinked. All the attention is used up on the first target. He's talking about the second target. So what he showed was that second target can be highly visible. But if you've seen the first target, you won't be able to report it. Nothing will be in the front of your head, just in the visual areas in the back of your head. But now the big question is this a conscious experience that you're not able to report? Or is it an unconscious, or as he says, pre-conscious experience? And here are the possibilities. So these arrows indicate where you're attending, okay? The arrow that points at the back of the head here means you're attending to the stimulus. The arrow that points away means you're not attending to the stimulus. So this one over here on the side, this is the unequivocally conscious case, where you're attending to the stimulus, you've got big activation, including a lot of feedback loops. Okay, that's the crucial thing for consciousness, these feedback loops. But it's triggering a lot of events in the front of the head so you can say what you saw. Then there's the crucial case that we just talked about, where your attention is absorbed by something else and you're not attending to the stimulus. That's the case of the attentional blink. And then there's subliminal perception, where you are attending, but you have a very weak stimulus. Okay? That's standard subliminal perception. So those really are the three cases. And the crucial case is that one in the middle that he calls the pre-conscious. Okay? So that's what I'm saying I think is actually probably conscious, not pre-conscious. So you may wonder, how would one possibly ever find out? So here's the crucial case. And the problem is, it's hard to tell whether the act of attending, when you do change your attention, enables access to a pre-existing conscious phenomenology, or whether it promotes an unconscious representation into consciousness. So this gets me to percepts versus concepts. So let me say a little more about what this distinction is. So I can tell you about it by telling you about a mistake made by Bruno Latour, who famously claimed that Pharaoh Ramses II could not have died of tuberculosis because tuberculosis was discovered only in 1882. So what was the mistake? And here's him saying it. That's a picture of Bruno Latour, and that's him saying, before Koch, the discoverer of tuberculosis, the bacillus had no real existence. To say that Ramses II, he says, died of tuberculosis is as absurd as saying that he died of machine gun fire. So he's confusing the concept of tuberculosis with the tuberculosis itself. So Koch is the originator of the concept of tuberculosis, but the tuberculosis bacteria existed, unfortunately, long before he found out he discovered it. So he was confusing the concept of tuberculosis with tuberculosis. So, and this is the basic distinction. It's the distinction between mind and world. Concepts are mental representations in the head, the bacteria. So that's what I mean by the distinction. Now, importantly, in the case of perception, we can have percepts without concepts. And a good example is babies. 4-month-old babies have perfectly good color vision, and I can tell you how we know that, but I'm not going to tell you that at the moment. However, if you do the following experiment with a green ball coming out on one side and a red ball coming out on the other side, the babies, 4-month-old babies, do not expect, when this thing goes down, they do not expect two things. Okay? They've seen red come out one side and green go out the other side, but they don't really notice. Okay? They see it perfectly well, but they don't notice. And that suggests that their color experience can be non-conceptual. By the way, this phenomenon, it's a bunch of related phenomena, were called in the early 20th century by a psychologist in Germany, it was called Farbendummheit. That little kids, and any of you who've had a little kid, you know, little kids really don't understand color. They see it, but they don't conceptualize it. So now we have the percept-concept distinction. Those kids have color percepts without color concepts. So there are two features of this distinction. One is computational role. Percepts are roughly informationally encapsulated. The perceptual system is somewhat isolated from cognition. Concepts, by contrast, to use a phrase that a number of people have used, are inferentially promiscuous. They can be freely substituted in thought. The part of their conceptual is they can be involved in reasoning, like this reasoning. And there's also the format. Percepts are thought to be iconic, that is somewhat picture-like, whereas concepts are more language-like and can be parts of thought. And so there's a joint, the idea is there's a joint in nature between perception and cognition, or thought. So here is a picture of the way perception and cognition work. It comes from a book by Tyler Burge, a recent book. we have a property, which he calls them attributes. Sensory transducers get them into the head. You have an iconic representation, which he thinks of as of a form with a singular element that picks out a single thing or space. And then with a perceptual representation of that. And then the next stage is a basic perceptual judgment. So that's the border between perception and cognition. Now the big problem is that it appears that the only way to find out about perception is to elicit perceptual judgment. That's been the big problem. The big problem in experiments is we want to find out about perception, but the only way to find out what people are perceiving is to ask them, at least conscious perception. However, there have been ways to get around this, and I'll show you a couple of ways, so I'm running short on time. The basic way, though, is to not ask the subject to do anything, or to ask them to do something irrelevant. So here is an experiment done by Michael Pitts. So here's what he did. The subject's task was to report something about dimming of dots on that circle. And he gave them trial after trial after trial. In some of those trials, the background formed a square or a diamond. Okay? But that wasn't, their task had nothing to, the background consisted of these little lines. Can people see those shapes? And sometimes there were these random arrays, but sometimes they formed actual figures. So he gave the subjects 240 trials of this stuff about dimming the red circles. And he didn't ask them anything about the figures in the back. And then after 240 trials, he asked them about, did they see figures in the back? Did they see a square, say? And what he found was, they were wired up with EEG sensors. What he found was the people who had seen the square showed activation in the back of the head, but not in the front of the head, suggesting the perceptual areas were responsible for conscious perception without cognition, because if they had cognition, it was a very minimal amount of cognition. So that supports my side. The second one has to do with a phenomenon called binocular rivalry, and here's where you're going to get to use your red and green glasses. So if you, I really wish we could shut off that light. Does nobody know where the light switch is?
Tony? I heard him earlier saying those are emergency lights. They won't go off.
Sorry. They won't go off. Okay. Well, I hope we can see this. Okay, so look at this thing. So look at this through the red and green glasses. Somebody want to say what you're seeing? You have both eyes open.
Portrait of a woman over a house.
You should be seeing, there should be a phenomenon. Keep looking. Don't blink.
Now it's just a woman.
Now it's just a woman. Okay, so what you should be seeing is face, then house, then face, then house. Is that happening?
Yes.
No, but I've only got one eye.
Oh, if you only got one eye. What?
It's very quickly.
If you keep watching, you'll see it will keep changing. It should go back and forth. Yeah, don't close an eye. Don't close an eye. You should be getting back and forth. Your whole visual field should be face, then your whole visual field should be house. What?
You don't have to blink?
No. Blinking is not needed. How many people are getting the alternation? Oh, good. Okay, so by the way, at the end, I need these to be handed in because I reuse them. In fact, maybe you can collect them. Okay, so what's happening here? Now, unfortunately, I don't have a diagram. Oh, yes, here's a diagram. So here's what happens. So this is somebody's head from the bottom. So what happens when you see the face, the area, the fusiform face area that's responsible for face, or part of which this face circuit lights up. When you see the house, there's this parahippocampal place area that lights up. So it's a phenomenon known as binocular rivalry. It's been much studied. Now, why am I mentioning it? The reason I mention it is because somebody did a very cool experiment, and it just came out in 2014. So what they did was, the experiment has a few parts, but I'll just tell you about this one part. What was in one eye was red lines going one way. What was in the other eye was green lines going the other way. And they had a method for telling what people were seeing. The method they had for telling what people were seeing involves this phenomenon known as nystagmus. So if you look at the eye, you'll see that the eye moves one way rather than the other. It moves and then goes back. They could tell from that what people were seeing. They didn't need the subjects to report, okay, because they could tell using this method with the eye. And what they found was that the difference in conscious perception was entirely in the visual and spatial areas in the back and the middle of the head. And here's a quote from the article. Importantly, when observers passively experienced rivalry, that is the back and forth between these experiences, without reporting perceptual alternations, a different picture emerged that is different from what they'd seen before, where the frontal areas were involved. Differential neural activity in frontal areas was absent. So that they're saying that the activity in the frontal areas that my opponents identify with conscious perception, that was absent. Activation in occipital and parietal regions, that's the back and the middle of the head, persisted. We conclude that frontal areas are associated with active report and introspection. So the idea is that they're supporting my side, the side that says that what's changing in the changing of perceptual experience is these back of the head non-cognitive areas, and they're contradicting this book, which just came out in 2014, which says, and I'm quoting from this book by Stanislas Dehaene, when the prefrontal cortex does not gain access to a message, it cannot be broadly shared and therefore remains unconscious. So they're showing that that's wrong. I think maybe I should I stop there? I have another section of this talk, but whatever.
It's very hard for me to gauge how the audience feels. Let's take a quick show of hands. How many would like to stop now and just have Q&A?
We can have a question
period,
which may be more crucial.
Those who want to stop now and have Q&A, raise your hands. One. Those who would like for Ned to continue for a while more, raise your hand. They'd like you to continue for a while.
Okay, so I have one more section which I can do. So this is about inaccessible consciousness. So far what I've talked about is not inaccessible. This is consciousness where someone can access it if they change what they're attending to. Now, a big problem with inaccessible, so this is another level of extremeness, if you like. One problem about inaccessible consciousness is you might think, how could it be my conscious state if I don't know about it? You know, the idea is that knowing about it is the essence of consciousness. And how could consciousness be so divorced from reasons and rationality? And so you might think this is consciousness in some attenuated sense of the terms. But I don't think that's right. And should give you an example that illustrates this. So this example is an example of what's called, there are two problems. One problem is hemiplegia. The guy's left arm is paralyzed. Yeah, his left arm, the one that's down there. His left arm is paralyzed, but he's got another neuropsych problem. So he had a stroke or something. His other neuropsych problem is what's called anosognosia. He does not admit he's got the paralysis problem, okay? So And this is a fairly common thing. You have a stroke, you're paralyzed, and the subject simply denies that they're paralyzed. No matter how you prove to them that they're paralyzed, they come up with some reason why the proofs aren't working. And this is usually in the acute phase. It lasts a month or two, and then later the person can see what's really happening. So this is a video of this guy. Now it's in Italian.
Se le chiedo di portare il braccio sinistro verso l'alto,
So we don't need
riuscirebbe a
this,
fare questo movimento?
Unfortunately, I can't turn
Bene
it
o con
off.
difficoltà?
I'm sorry. I'm sorry for all this noise.
Se le chiedo di chiudere e aprire la mano sinistra, riuscirebbe a fare il
So
movimento?
the crucial moment will be when she asks him to raise his left
Senta,
hand.
adesso ha qualche problema? Come va il suo braccio sinistro?
So you notice that he hardly speaks. You can't even hear him. He sounds depressed.
Ascolti, può
He seems depressed.
muoverlo? Proviamo a muoverlo. Senta, il braccio sinistro adesso, col braccio sinistro, provi a raggiungere la mia mano.
He's trying. He's trying.
L'ha fatto? Ok.
So he says he's done it. So what's going on here? Now, there are some cases of anosognosia where the patient is actually hallucinated that they've done it. But there are reasons to think this kind of case is not one of those. This seems to be a cognitive problem. It's not explained perceptually, it's explained cognitively. They've got a cognitive problem about admitting that they have this problem. And some of the evidence for this comes from work by neuropsychologist Tony Marcel, who noticed that if you ask one of these patients, how well can you open a beer bottle, or row a boat, or tie your shoes, as compared with, if I was in the state you are in, how well would I be able to open a beer bottle, row a boat, tie my shoes? You get a much higher rating for themselves doing it than for you doing it if you were in their state. Another example is, how strong is this the good arm? How strong is this the bad arm? You get the same answer. But if you say, is this arm the good arm ever naughty? Is this arm the bad arm ever naughty? The good arm they say, huh, and the bad arm they say, yes, it is sometimes naughty and I'm thinking of punishing it. That's an example thing they might say. So they show some awareness of the problem they've got. And the word that people have to describe this is, the word is confabulation. Now, it just doesn't prove that they have a conscious experience of it, but there is some evidence that they have conscious experience, and maybe I'll just go to that evidence and then finish with that. Probably the most convincing evidence comes from patients who have recovered. After 2 months, they typically recover, and here is a lady who's recovered, and I'll just play you a little bit of her. So the, Katerina Fotopoulou, the neuropsychologist, is asking her.
Okay, so you just told me that yesterday we had a great breakthrough, didn't we? Huh? Tell me about it. What did you learn?
More realistic.
You were more realistic about what?
My left side not being able to do it.
Not being able to do anything. Okay, how do you feel about that now?
It's sad, but it's all right.
It's sad, but it's all right. Okay. You also told me something about the sense of control. Do you remember what you told me about the sense of control?
Yes, it was difficult feeling I had lost control of it.
But how do you feel now?
I think you said that I could learn to have some control, but in a different way.
Okay. Does it make any sense? I'm glad. I'm glad you remember all this. Okay. Now, if I were to ask you, during this time, as you said, you weren't so realistic, what did you believe about your past?
This is a crucial thing right here.
It might have moved, or I might be able to do it.
And you genuinely believe that? Huh? Did you have any emotions? How did it feel in your arm? Were you afraid or anything?
It was frustrating. I could see it wasn't really moving.
See, she said I could see it wasn't moving.
Huh? So what made you say that it was?
I was hoping perhaps.
You were hoping.
So what you just heard was her saying, I could, yeah, it was hard. What she said was, you know, there's a hospital, there's a lot of noise. If you listen to it with earphones, you can hear it. What she said was, I could see them. You know, so I have a previous video of this lady denying that she's paralyzed, just like that first guy. Now what she says is, I know I'm paralyzed. I know I was paralyzed. And so the psychologist is asking her why she said before that she wasn't paralyzed. And she says, I could see that the arm wasn't moving, and I was hoping it would move, she says. So here's the key point. We have reason to think this is a cognitive blockage. I mean, there are a number of different possibilities. They are here that she might have had the kinesthetic experiences, but blockage at the level of report or narrative about the self, or maybe being able to, what's called global broadcasting, make these ideas available. They all involve fractionation of this global broadcasting that is supposed to be part of what my opponents think consciousness is. So these are possibly cases of conscious experience without knowledge of, without clear cognitive accessibility. So let me be clear about what I'm arguing for. This is weak evidence that the patient experienced the paralysis but couldn't report it, but it's strong evidence that it makes sense. That's really what I'm arguing for, is that this makes sense. My opponents think I'm contradicting myself to talk about experience that you can't report. So here are my conclusions. The most recent one is that consciousness without cognitive accessibility makes sense. Second, that there's some evidence for conscious percepts without actual cognitive access. And there's some evidence that consciousness is rich and cognition is sparse, and that explains those inattentional blindness cases. And that's the end.
We'll take Q&A for a while, and then there are about 2 books left. If anybody wants, there are pretty serious books in the back of Ned's, and first come, first, they're $30 a piece. First come, first serve, and he will inscribe it to you. Now do Q&A. Raise your hands if you have a question.
Yes, so if I understood you, fundamentally you're saying that the conscious is rich and cognitive is sparse.
Yeah.
Where does the language come into display in the sense of, is our knowledge limited our ability to articulate it, or the cognitive?
Yeah, language is part of cognition.
So,
and there are many concepts that we don't get until we get the words. So color words, learning color words for babies is what gives them the color concepts.
So fundamentally we have no knowledge unless we can articulate it?
Well, okay, so that's, there's some truth in that, but of course, there are these famous cases like Helen Keller, who didn't have language until quite late, but when she got language, she talked about all the thoughts she had before. So maybe there is some kind of an innate language, and you can make up your own language. You don't need an external language, apparently.
Yeah, maybe not an external language or communicative language, but it's an agent that we must have.
Well, it depends on how you want to use the word language, I guess. But you need some representational system for concepts.
Richard?
Well, 2-part question. First is whether or not there's really strong evidence that especially the last thing that we saw couldn't be explained by the Freud's initial concepts of unconscious, preconscious, and conscious. So again, whether or not a lot of these things are just there in your unconscious and then selectively come into consciousness, and related to mechanisms of defense, which Freud and Anna Freud talked about a lot. My second part is, do you think I mean, these
why don't I answer the first part?
Go for the first part.
Yeah, so I'm not making any claim about strong evidence for anything. I'm really in that stuff about the neuropsychological syndromes. I'm just trying to illustrate that the idea of inaccessible consciousness makes sense. I'm not trying to argue that it exists.
I'm thinking it could either be biologically based in terms of perception and cognition, or it could be based on the defense against not wanting to know that your arm.
Yeah,
it could go either way.
The psychologist I mentioned who's doing this work has something of a Freudian kind of account, and I can actually show you. She actually did. She used these. I mean, these are they're clinical tests. She asked subjects to fill in the missing word. So the missing word were in sentences like "a hoist is often used to lift paralyzed patients off the blank," and the result is that these anasygnosic paralyzed patients were slower in answering these than other paralyzed patients who weren't anasygnosic. So that is a little bit of evidence for a kind of psychodynamic point of view.
Now, my second part question is, how much of these questions may get answered with more specificity once we use sophisticated NMRI and imaging approaches and actually can see parts of the brain? And I'm worried about reductionistic views that it's all either frontal or parietal or occipital, that the fact that we proved that one is frontal and the other one's occipital doesn't prove that one doesn't exist somewhere either in awareness or sub-awareness. And then also the idea that maybe different parts of your brain may be awake or asleep at the same time. I find this happening at night when I'm, or mothers who can attend to their babies at night while they're still sleeping. Right. So there are many different levels of awareness and consciousness.
No, I agree with all that. Look, the big problem is we actually know enough about what brain areas are lighting up. The big problem is we don't know how to think about those areas. So, DeHaan, who's one of really the great cognitive neuroscientists of our era, has shown that the back of the head is lighting up for these perception cases where the subject can't report. So so he calls it preconscious. I say, I think it might well be conscious. So how do you decide? So that's why I describe those two experiments where the subject doesn't have to report. See, this is the key. It's not a fancy high-tech idea. It's an extremely low-tech idea. It's give the subject a perceptual experience and don't ask him to do anything or ask him to do something else. And so that one experiment where the subject was asked to report about red dots, while at the same time what they're really interested in is whether he was seeing any patterns in the background. And then after 240 trials of the red dots, they asked the subject about the patterns in the background, and then they could make a correlation between the subject's ability to report those patterns and what was going on in the brain imaging. And then the other one was that binocular rivalry without asking the person to do anything. So it turns out the technology of doing that is somewhat difficult. The big advance was in this extremely low-tech thing of being able to track what the person is experiencing using the eye movements.
By the way, the other thing about the second the second green word experiment. If you tap an Aplysia's snout, the first time it's going to react big time. The second time it doesn't react. I mean, this is 10,000 brain cells instead of all of. But there's an extinction phenomenon that happens with.
I don't know if this is the same though.
Yeah, this could be different because it's much more complex. Brain. We're talking.
Any other questions? This young lady. Go ahead.
They say that after 80, 1 in 3 of us is going to have Alzheimer's. Does this have any bearing in any way on the research and the stuff going on with Alzheimer's today? None?
Not really. Well, look, maybe there is some bearing, but I don't know about that research. So I'm actually interested, I'm a philosopher. I'm interested mostly in normal perception. So I haven't studied, mostly I haven't studied diseases, but some of this neuropsychological stuff is very relevant to my interest, so I'm interested in that.
You know?
So yeah, I just wonder how much of the disagreement between your opponents, you and your opponents, is verbal about what we mean by consciousness.
Yeah.
Right. What we should call conscious versus unconscious. I think you've in the past drawn distinctions between different kinds of consciousness.
Yeah.
And maybe that's what's at issue, right? Is that you have something different in mind than your opponents when you talk about whether it's conscious or not.
Yeah. Well, okay, so Dehaan says what he's studying is conscious access, and that makes it look kind of verbal. But he thinks he's studying the only thing you can study. So that makes it not look verbal. Yeah?
I feel this is a very simplistic question and it would be a wonderful talk, but I keep thinking about the use of this with individuals and what they do. For instance, I keep thinking about an airport controller who sees it but doesn't see it and needs to report it.
Look, that's a really important thing. I mean, when these phenomena were first discovered, people immediately realized that that they were really important from the point of view of car accidents and other such things. And a number of years ago, a perceptual psychologist at Yale, Brian Scholl, he did an experiment where people were given cell phones and asked to produce a conversation even though there was nobody on the other end, because they didn't want the variable about what the person on the other end was saying. And what they showed was that the so-called inattentional blindness was greatly increased when the subject was having a cell phone conversation. And this research is enormously important from the point of view of car accidents and also airplane accidents. They've done experiments with pilots that show they have exactly the same problems of, there's a disagreement about how to describe it. I say it's a problem in noticing, and my opponents say it's a problem in seeing. But either way, it's serious. If you don't notice the obstacle in front of you, you might crash into it. So this is the scientific basis for prohibiting cell phone conversations in cars and for pilots. They should not be allowed because attentional resources are limited. If your attention is being soaked up by say a cell phone conversation, you will not notice what's in front of you, and that's a serious problem. And my opponents say you won't see it, but I say you won't notice it. But that's not really. It doesn't really matter. If you don't notice it or you don't see it, you're really in deep trouble. Yeah.
So how do you distribute your attention?
A little louder.
Okay. How do you distribute your attention?
You're not really in control of it. Your attention, it's a subpersonal mechanism. It just gets soaked up by whatever you're doing. So attention is being much studied now, but there's just no way to increase your attention. It's a limited resource.
Isn't the car of the future supposed to be self-driving?
Yeah.
Well, how are they going to, is that going to be easier or harder to program?
Well, I don't know. I'm on the mental side of it, not the machine side of it.
Okay, well, let's take two more questions, one here and one here.
The difference between seeing and noticing, I'm sure it's a populist question, but can you settle it with hypnosis? Will I be able to recall the gorilla if you hypnotize me?
I don't think so. This is a basic mechanism that some things are getting in. I guess you could try to hypnotize people to not obey instructions to count the passes. But if they're counting the passes, they're not going to see it.
They are not going to see it. They cannot recall it. They under-hypnotic.
Sorry, they're not going to notice it. I don't mean to.
Okay, this last gentleman, let's go ahead. Which one of you is asking?
So you talked about all these studies that show that we can perceive without conceptualizing. You probably have thought about this. How is this adaptive? So I'm thinking of it from an evolutionary psychological point of view. Do you have anything to say about that? Have you thought about it?
Yeah, it's one of these. I think that there are constraints on mechanisms, and it looks like for whatever reason there's a big constraint on the machinery of cognition. I mean, one thing that people talk about as a key thing is that if you ask the question how many how much of the brain can be active at any one time. It turns out it's a surprisingly small amount. So Peter Lenny has calculated that it's 1% of your neurons can be active at any one time. So that suggests a good reason why you need some kind of selection.
You wanted, this poor gentleman wanted, he was dying to ask a question. Go ahead, ask the last one.
Okay, it's actually related to a comment I made before, not seeing out of one eye. That's actually seems to be related to this. I'm amblyoptic. When I ordinarily do not notice what I see out of my left eye. If I close my right eye, I can see a little, but it's against a black background. Now this was in response to, I was born cross-eyed, and to stop myself from walking into doors as originally I was, I had the operation which fixed the cross-eye, but by that time my brain had told itself not to see what is coming in through my left eye, so there's no organic problem. But again, I just do not notice what comes in out of my into my left eye. Is that an example of this?
Oh, you know, I have no idea what the explanation of that is. You know, there is a critical period for vision. That is a period. You need certain experiences early on for your visual system to work. You know, there's a vision scientist at MIT, Pawan Sinha, who has done cataract operations on children in India. So if a kid is born with cataracts in the U.S., they're removed early in life, and the kid can see perfectly fine. But in India, they don't have the apparatus or the money to do this. And so there are a lot of children and adults with congenital cataracts. And the finding is that they never get their vision back. If the visual system isn't trained up with working eyes, you know, at a very young age, it never really works properly. So you can rewire. In fact, you know, there's another guy at MIT, Binocular Rivalry, who's rewired the auditory system of a ferret to actually see. So, you know, early feed the signals that feed a brain area completely rewire the brain area.
Fascinating. Thank you very much, Ned. Maybe we'll stay here for a couple of minutes back here. If anyone would like to purchase his book or ask him a question, it'll be there.